You've been lied to about what women actually want, and the biggest lie is that being a good, agreeable, rule-following man will earn you love and respect when in reality it guarantees you'll be taken for granted, friend-zoned, or cheated on by women who claim they want nice guys but consistently choose men who challenge them instead. 300 years ago, Voltaire warned that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And the absurdity most men believe today is that female approval is worth sacrificing their authenticity, standards, and self-respect. This belief commits the atrocity of turning strong men into weak validation seekers who wonder why their relationships always end in disappointment and betrayal. The uncomfortable truth that no one wants to tell you is that the moment you stop following society's rules about how men should behave in relationships, everything changes. You become simultaneously more attractive and more threatening because you represent something most women have never experienced. A man who values his own opinion more than her temporary emotions. What Voltaire discovered about challenging authority applies directly to modern dating. And once you understand why she'll hate you for thinking independently, you'll finally understand why that hatred is actually the beginning of genuine respect and attraction rather than the end of it. Society has spent your entire life conditioning you to be the ideal consumer, the perfect employee, and the safest romantic option. You were taught to follow rules without question, seek approval from authority figures, and never rock the boat because a compliant man is a profitable man. From childhood you learned that being nice gets you rewards, that following instructions makes you valuable, and that your worth comes from how well you fit into the system rather than how authentically you express your own values and desires. This programming runs so deep that most men never realize they're living someone else's blueprint for their life, especially when it comes to relationships where they've been taught that sacrifice, compromise, and putting her needs first is the path to love and respect. The educational system reinforced this by rewarding conformity over creativity, obedience over independent thinking, and collaboration over individual excellence. You were graded on how well you followed directions rather than how brilliantly you questioned them. Corporate culture continued this programming by promoting team players who never challenge the status quo, who always say yes to overtime, and who measure their success by external validation rather than internal satisfaction. In relationships, this translates to men who seek constant reassurance, who change their opinions to match their partner's preferences, and who believe that being agreeable is the same as being attractive when in reality it often breeds contempt and boredom. The tragic irony is that the very qualities society taught you would make you desirable actually make you forgettable. Women are biologically programmed to be attracted to men who can think independently, make decisions confidently, and stand firm in their convictions even when facing social pressure. Yet most men spend their lives trying to be everything to everyone, seeking approval from their boss, their friends, their family, and especially from women, never realizing that this desperate need for validation is precisely what makes them unattractive. Voltaire understood that true power comes from thinking for yourself, and until you break free from society's programming, you'll remain trapped in a cycle of seeking approval from people who will never respect you for your compliance. Voltaire lived in an era where questioning authority could get you imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Yet he understood that intellectual freedom was worth any risk, because a mind enslaved to popular opinion is no mind at all. He famously declared that he would defend to the death your right to express ideas he disagreed with, recognizing that true strength comes not from silencing opposition, but from confidently holding our ground against it. In relationships, this translates to having the courage to maintain your perspectives even when she challenges them, tests them, or tries to shame you into changing them. Most men crumble at the first sign of feminine disapproval, immediately backtracking and apologizing for having independent thoughts. The philosopher witnessed how men of his time would abandon their principles the moment social pressure mounted, choosing comfort over conviction and safety over authenticity. He observed that those who think for themselves inevitably face resistance from those who profit from conformity, whether that's the church, the state, or in modern times, the dating marketplace that rewards predictable behavior. When you start questioning why you should pay for every date, why you should always text back immediately, or why you should change your weekend plans whenever she calls, you're engaging in the same intellectual rebellion that Voltaire championed. Centuries ago, this independent thinking becomes dangerous because it reveals how many of your beliefs about relationships were never really yours to begin with. They were installed by a society that benefits from your compliance and confusion. Voltaire knew that once a man starts thinking critically about one area of life, that questioning spreads to everything else, creating a domino effect that transforms not just how you date, but how you live, work, and define success on your own terms. The instant you stop performing for her validation, something shifts in the entire dynamic that most men never understand, because they've never experienced what it feels like to be genuinely indifferent to feminine approval. You stop editing your jokes to make sure they're politically correct. You stop pretending to love her favorite movies, and you stop apologizing for having opinions that might make her uncomfortable. This isn't about being rude or dismissive. It's about being authentic even when authenticity comes with social costs. Voltaire understood that seeking approval from others is the fastest way to lose yourself. And in relationships, this manifests as men who shape-shift into whatever they think she wants, rather than remaining consistently themselves regardless of her reactions. When you stop seeking her approval, you inadvertently trigger her curiosity because suddenly you become unpredictable, challenging, and emotionally unavailable in ways that create genuine attraction rather than the fake intimacy that comes from constant validation seeking. She starts wondering what you're thinking, why you're not affected by her moods, and how you can remain so centered when every other man in her life desperately wants her approval. This shift happens because you're no longer operating from scarcity, but from abundance, not because you have other options, but because you've found your center within yourself. Most men mistake this for playing games, but it's actually the opposite. It's finally being real instead of performing. The paradox is that the less you need her approval, the more likely you are to earn her respect. But you can only achieve this detachment by genuinely finding your own sources of validation and meaning beyond any relationship. Women are attracted to conformity initially because it signals safety, predictability, and social acceptance. You dress well, have a stable job, say the right things at parties, and represent everything her friends and family would approve of in a partner. This attraction to your conformity is evolutionary programming designed to help her find a mate who can provide security and fit seamlessly into her social world without causing drama or conflict. Voltaire recognized this human tendency to seek comfort in the familiar, but he also understood that comfort and respect are entirely different emotions, and what makes someone feel safe rarely makes them feel passion or genuine admiration for your character and strength. The problem emerges when she realizes that your conformity isn't a choice but a compulsion. You're not choosing to dress well and be polite because you've thoughtfully decided these behaviors serve your goals, but because you're terrified of social rejection and desperately need external validation. She begins to test your boundaries, challenge your opinions, and create conflict not because she wants to fight, but because she's unconsciously searching for evidence that there's a real man underneath all that social programming. When you consistently fold under pressure, agree with her even when she's wrong, and change your plans whenever she expresses displeasure, she loses respect because she realizes you're not actually strong enough to handle her at her worst. This creates a devastating cycle where your attempts to keep her happy through compliance actually push her away because attraction requires tension, challenge, and the knowledge that you could walk away if she doesn't treat you well. Voltaire understood that every society operates on an unwritten social contract, where individuals surrender certain freedoms in exchange for acceptance and protection. But in modern relationships, this contract has become a trap that destroys masculine authenticity. You've unconsciously agreed to trade your natural instincts, your honest opinions, and your personal boundaries for the promise of female companionship and social approval. This contract tells you to split every bill equally even when you earn more, to celebrate her career achievements while downplaying your own, and to prioritize her emotional needs above your own mental health. The devastating part is that most men don't even realize they've signed this contract. because it was presented as basic decency rather than the soul-crushing compromise it actually represents. This social contract in relationships mirrors what Voltaire observed about religious and political institutions. They maintain power by convincing people that their sacrifice is noble, necessary, and ultimately beneficial when in reality it serves the institution more than the individual. In dating, you're told that being the supportive boyfriend who never challenges her, never has needs of your own, and never expresses dissatisfaction is what good men do. But this programming creates relationships built on resentment rather than genuine compatibility. She begins to see you as a servant rather than a partner, because you've essentially agreed to play that role in exchange for her continued presence in your life. The social contract becomes destructive when you realize that the very behaviors you thought would secure her love actually guarantee her eventual contempt, because respect cannot exist without the possibility of loss. Religious and cultural programming has taught you that sacrifice is love, that putting others first is virtue, and that questioning traditional relationship roles makes you selfish or immature. These beliefs run so deep that most men never examine whether they actually serve their happiness or just perpetuate cycles of resentment and unfulfillment. Voltaire spent his life challenging religious dogma precisely because he understood how these unexamined beliefs control behavior in ways that often contradict human nature and individual well-being. In dating, this manifests as men who believe they must always be the provider, the protector, and the emotional support system while expecting nothing in return. Accept the privilege of her company. Cultural dogma tells you that masculinity means never showing vulnerability, always having the answers, and taking responsibility for her emotions even when her reactions are completely unreasonable or manipulative. These beliefs create internal conflict because they force you to suppress natural human needs for reciprocity, appreciation, and emotional safety in relationships. You end up dating women who drain your energy, disrespect your boundaries, and take your efforts for granted because you've been programmed to see this dynamic as normal rather than toxic. Voltaire recognized that blind adherence to tradition often prevents people from creating better systems based on reason and mutual benefit. The most dangerous aspect of this programming is that it disguises dysfunction as duty. When you feel exhausted, unappreciated, or emotionally neglected in relationships, you're taught to work harder rather than evaluate whether the relationship itself is fundamentally imbalanced and whether your cultural beliefs about love are actually destroying your capacity for genuine intimacy. When you start thinking independently about relationships, you inevitably discover that most dating advice, cultural expectations, and feminine demands are designed to benefit women at the expense of masculine fulfillment and self-respect. This realization comes with a steep price because intellectual independence means you can no longer participate in the comfortable illusions that keep most relationships functioning. You begin to see manipulation tactics, double standards, and emotional blackmail for what they really are rather than accepting them as normal relationship dynamics. Voltaire paid the price for his intellectual independence through exile, imprisonment, and constant social persecution. But he understood that living according to other people's beliefs is a form of spiritual death, that no amount of social acceptance can justify that. The moment you start questioning why you should always initiate contact, why you should tolerate disrespectful behavior, or why her feelings are always more important than your own, you become incompatible with women who profit from male compliance and confusion. This creates a lonely period where you're too aware to settle for dysfunction, but not yet skilled enough to attract women who appreciate intellectual independence and emotional strength. Most women have been conditioned to prefer men they can control rather than men they can respect. Your new standards eliminate the majority of potential partners because you're no longer willing to play games, tolerate inconsistency, or pretend that bad behavior is acceptable when it comes from an attractive woman. The price of intellectual independence is the loss of comfortable illusions, but the reward is the possibility of relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than mutual dysfunction and social programming. When you respectfully but firmly challenge her beliefs, opinions, or behaviors, you trigger a psychological response that most men never experience because they're too afraid of conflict to engage. In intellectual disagreement, this isn't about being argumentative or dismissive. It's about having enough confidence in your own thinking to maintain your position, even when she uses emotional manipulation, social pressure, or sexual withdrawal to force your compliance. Voltaire understood that ideas only grow stronger when they're tested against opposition, and relationships follow the same principle. A woman cannot respect a man whose convictions crumble the moment she expresses displeasure or threatens to leave. Challenging her beliefs makes you irresistible because it demonstrates that you value truth and authenticity more than her temporary approval. This signals strength, independence, and the kind of masculine leadership that creates genuine attraction rather than the fake intimacy that comes from constant agreement. She realizes that you're not another validation-seeking male who will abandon his principles to keep her happy, which paradoxically makes her want to earn your respect and approval instead of taking it for granted. However, this same quality makes you terrifying because it means she cannot control you through the emotional tactics that work on most men. The fear comes from her realization that you might actually leave if she doesn't bring genuine value to the relationship. Suddenly she's dealing with a man who has standards, boundaries, and the self-respect to walk away from dysfunction, regardless of how attracted he is to her physically or emotionally. Voltaire developed his unshakable convictions not through blind faith or stubborn arrogance, but through rigorous intellectual examination, constant questioning, and the willingness to change his mind when presented with better evidence or reasoning. His method involved studying multiple perspectives on every issue, understanding the motivations behind different belief systems, and then forming conclusions based on logic rather than emotion or social pressure. This process made his convictions incredibly strong because they were built on solid intellectual foundations rather than inherited assumptions or cultural programming. In relationships, this means developing your standards, boundaries, and values through careful consideration of what actually serves your long-term happiness, rather than what temporarily avoids conflict or gains approval. The philosopher's approach required him to regularly examine his own beliefs for inconsistencies, biases, and areas where he might be deceiving himself. He understood that true intellectual honesty means being your own harshest critic, while remaining confident in conclusions that survive rigorous self-examination. This translates to dating by constantly evaluating whether your relationship behaviors align with your stated values, whether you're compromising your standards for reasons that actually make sense, and whether your actions reflect genuine choice or unconscious programming. Most men never develop this level of self-awareness, which is why their convictions collapse under the first sign of feminine disapproval or social pressure. Voltaire's method creates unshakable convictions because they're based on understanding, rather than mere opinion. When you truly understand why you believe something, external pressure cannot easily change your mind because you've already considered and rejected the alternatives through careful reasoning. The ultimate paradox that Voltaire illuminated is that true freedom requires accepting complete responsibility for your choices, which means you can no longer blame society, women, or circumstances for your relationship outcomes. This terrifies most men because it's easier to remain a victim of social programming than to accept that their dating struggles stem from their own lack of courage, standards, and self-respect. Freedom means you have the power to walk away from any situation that doesn't serve you, but it also means you must develop the strength, skills, and self-sufficiency to actually exercise that power when necessary. Most men want the benefits of freedom without the responsibility it demands, preferring to complain about modern dating while continuing to engage in the same behaviors that create their frustration and disappointment. Voltaire understood that freedom is not the absence of consequences, but the ability to choose your consequences consciously. When you stop following society's relationship rules, you'll face rejection, loneliness, and social criticism, but you'll also gain the possibility of authentic connections based on genuine compatibility, rather than mutual dysfunction. The paradox is that the men who need relationships the least are the ones who attract the highest quality partners, while those who desperately seek validation through romance inevitably repel the very women they most want to attract. This creates a catch-22 where you must become emotionally independent before you can create healthy interdependence with another person. True freedom in relationships means being willing to be alone, rather than settling for dysfunction, which, ironically, makes you far more attractive than men who cling desperately to any female attention they receive. Voltaire's greatest insight was that most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, and nowhere is this more evident than in modern relationships where men choose the familiar pain of dysfunction over the unknown territory of authentic masculinity. The philosopher who dared to challenge kings, priests, and entire social systems understood that real freedom begins the moment you stop seeking approval from people who profit from your confusion and compliance. When you apply his intellectual courage to your dating life, you discover that most relationship problems stem not from women being inherently difficult, but from men being too weak to maintain standards, boundaries, and genuine self-respect in the face of feminine testing and social pressure. The men who follow Voltaire's example by thinking independently, challenging popular beliefs, and refusing to compromise their core values for temporary comfort will inevitably face resistance from a culture that needs their compliance to function. However, they will also discover something that validation-seeking men never experience: the respect of high-quality women who are tired of dating boys disguised as men, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically rather than performing for applause. The question that will determine your entire romantic future is this: will you continue following society's rules for male behavior and accept the mediocre relationships they produce? Or will you have the courage to think for yourself and create the standards that attract the kind of woman who actually deserves your time, energy, and commitment? If this resonates with you, subscribe for more insights that challenge conventional wisdom about relationships and masculinity.